Welcome to this leg of the Rush Ranch audio tour. My name is Jasmine, and I'm the Senior Project Manager in charge of stewardship at Solano Land Trust. I'm going to begin with a little orientation of where you are on the landscape, and then describe the scene before you. As you sit with the Nature Center at your back, you are facing west. Your left shoulder is pointing south, and your right shoulder is pointing north. If you were to raise your left arm and hold it around a 45-degree angle from that straight line in front of you, or about halfway between west and south, you would be pointing at San Francisco. If you're here at Rush Ranch in the afternoon, you may be feeling the sunshine on your face as the sun sets to the west, and maybe the breeze from the bay. Most afternoons, we get a refreshing breeze from the San Francisco Bay. Directly in front of you here at Rush Ranch is the Sire Arena, where our partners at Access Adventure train young horses and work with beginning equestrians. You may hear the gentle pounding of hooves if someone is riding in the arena. West of the arena is a eucalyptus grove. Eucalyptus is native to Australia, but it plays an interesting role in California history. Eucalyptus was first introduced in the 1850s by Australian gold miners who were coming to California for the gold rush, but it really took off in the early 1900s. At the beginning of the 20th century, the U.S. Forest Service warned that the U.S. might be using its hardwood timber too quickly and might be running out of resources. People became concerned that there'd be no lumber to build more homes and cities. With no predators or pathogens here, and being really well adapted to a drier climate in Australia, the eucalyptus trees grew really quickly in California. The average was 4 to 6 feet per year, and this excited folks. They thought that eucalyptus would be the new redwood, and if they planted eucalyptus, they would all become wealthy timber barons. As such, eucalyptus plantations were planted from Mendocino on down to Southern California and all throughout the Central Valley. Eager would-be timber farmers planted hundreds of eucalyptus per acre, resulting in millions of trees. A single eucalyptus farmer in Oakland famously planted 8 million trees on his property alone. Unfortunately for all these hopeful eucalyptus farmers, the bubble of speculation burst when people realized that young eucalyptus wood cracks and splits. The same chemical compounds that give it that iconic smell also make the wood really dry, and as it matures after it's been cut, it cracks and splinters apart and is just not safe to be used in building homes. Eucalyptus was determined to be only safe for firewood, and many of these speculators realized that harvesting the trees would cost more than they were actually worth, and the eucalyptus plantations were left standing. On our Solano Land Trust properties, we have mixed feelings about the eucalyptus. On the one hand, the trees on our properties provide nesting habitats for birds. The grove in front of you supports both a red-tailed hawk and a great horned owl nest at opposite ends of the windbreak. When you visit our picnic area, you'll likely hear birds calling from the cluster of eucalyptus on that end of the park. If you come back in the spring, the sound of birdsong in the eucalyptus can be so loud that during one field trip, a 4th grader once complained to me that the birds were too loud for him to learn. But the eucalyptus are not native here, and as beneficial as they can be for the birds, they can actually be very bad for native plants. Eucalyptus trees are allelopathic. This means that they release their own special herbicides into the soil to kill off the competition. Often we think of plants as passive, just racing each other for sunlight, but eucalyptus are masters of chemical warfare. Over the years, Solano Land Trust staff have tried to plant oaks under or near the eucalyptus, hoping that as the eucalyptus in the picnic area die or are removed, the oaks could replace them for bird habitat and shade for the visitors. But the trees that have survived that area are not growing quickly or well. One of them especially has a very twisted, contorted trunk. This growth form is a common distress sign in trees that are growing in harsh conditions. Oaks we've planted farther away from the eucalyptus that are the same age are much taller, broader, and have straighter trunks. We also have some safety concerns surrounding fire in eucalyptus, as Californians were all well aware of the dangers of wildfire. Those same aromatic compounds that make eucalyptus smell so good are highly flammable. This means that eucalyptus trees catch fire quickly, and when they burn much hotter than our native oak trees do. We work very hard to maintain the trees around Rush Ranch to keep the fire risk very low. The particular eucalyptus windbreak in front of you is used for a unique purpose. Access Adventure volunteers and driving students actually use the trees as an obstacle course to hone their skills and to give their horses new challenges. Past the trees, you would enter what at first seems to be just an empty field. But this is actually the site of a native plant experiment that has botany nerds like myself just really very excited. California has become invaded by annual grasses from Europe and Asia, so much so that you may have heard the term California annual grassland. California's rangelands used to be dominated by perennial bunch grasses and wildflowers. It's actually a complete ecosystem shift over to an annual grassland. While many people have tried to reestablish native grasses, it can be difficult to manage the non-natives and very expensive to purchase enough native grass seeds to establish a competitive native community. This experiment uses seeded strip methods, in which the field was divided into strips. Every other strip was planted, aka seeded, in native seeds. We try to nurture those strips and always let the plants in those seeded strips grow to maturity and produce their own seed. The unplanted strips contain mostly invasive grasses, and we try to mow those before they can set seed. If you came out directly after a mowing, you could feel the vegetation height change as you walked along the path through the experiment. The idea is that over time, the native strips will start to release seed into the unseeded strips and eventually come to cover the whole field. We've been fairly successful so far, but this is an ongoing experiment. The original project was a partnership between Solano Land Trust, UC Davis, and the Carbon Cycle Institute, and was funded by the California Coastal Conservancy. There are many benefits to converting back to native grasses, including carbon sequestration. Perennials have deeper and more fibrous root systems than annuals, allowing them to translocate carbon deeper into the soil and store it there rather than in the atmosphere. Solano Land Trust has partnered with Point Blue, who are studying how native seeded strips are sequestering carbon compared to non-native strips. This data will be added to a statewide data set to inform climate policies and practices throughout California. Once you have passed through the seeded strip experiment, you are finally reaching the edge of the marsh. As the grasses start to fade away, there are a few dry depressions. These are actually natural salt flats, just very small ones, maybe 50 feet long and only 4 feet wide. These areas are coated in what is called salt efflorescence. As salty marsh water evaporates, the salt crystals are translocated up through the soil and left behind on the soil surface. These small salt flats are home to a very unusual beetle, the senile tiger beetle. The senile tiger beetles are very small and well camouflaged to their environment, but what makes them remarkable is how very hairy they are. Their underbellies, legs, and even parts of their heads are covered in these long, silvery hairs. It's almost like they are little old men with beards that drag along the ground. Senile tiger beetles are rare, with some researchers working to have them listed as endangered. Continuing west, the grasslands merge into the marsh. This zone is called the transition zone or the intermediate zone. Plants here are adapted to salty soils from the tidal marsh, and they can handle both dry periods and wet periods. These salt-tolerant plants usually have one of two strategies for managing the salt, either storage or extrusion. Some plants store salt in vacuoles within their cells. Others push the salt out, forming salt crystals on their leaves. If you were to brush your fingers over saltgrass or Frankenia, they would come back coated in salt, especially in summer. One of the dominant plants in the transition zone is pickleweed. Pickleweed is one of those plants that stores the salt inside of itself. I believe that later on today you may be offered the opportunity to try pickleweed. Pickleweed is a very interesting plant. It looks and feels as if someone glued tiny miniature pickles end to end together. And when you eat it, it tastes like pickles. Eating pickleweed is absolutely safe, but like any salty snack, it can make you thirsty and should be consumed in moderation. Some people add pickleweed to salads for a pop of flavor, and some companies actually sell dried and ground pickleweed as green salt, an alternative to table or sea salt. Some of the other transition zone plants are Frankenia, saltgrass, and salt marsh fleabane. Frankenia is sometimes called alkali heath. It grows in salty soils, but it does not really like to stay wet, so it is really only found in the transition zone at Rush Ranch. It has small leaves that will be covered in salt crystals, and tiny pinkish purple flowers that are pollinated by very small native bees. Saltgrass has a very distinctive texture and structure. Hopefully you will have some at the plant stop, but I'm a plant nerd and I can't help describing it to you right now. This is a grass that feels like it's already been picked, pressed, and preserved. Most lawn grasses are soft and bendy, but saltgrass is tough and coarse. When you rub your fingers over the blades, you can feel the ridges running parallel to the blade edges. All grasses have these ridges in their internal structure, but on most of them, they're too fine to be felt. You may also feel the grittiness of salt crystals on the blades. As you hold saltgrass, stroke it and press it between your palms. Do you notice that it feels kind of flat? All of the blades are coming out on the same plane. It's very unusual for grasses and very iconic of saltgrass to be structured like that. Finally, the tips of blades are actually kind of sharp and pointy. They will only become sharper as the grass dries out. Saltgrass is a winter deciduous grass. It goes dormant over the winter and grows in the summer, almost the opposite of most grasses. The final transition zone plant I hope you'll get to experience today is salt marsh fleabane. Such a long name, but it's informative. This plant only grows in salty or brackish marshes, and it was used to repel fleas. Please smell the leaves. The oils in these leaves can help deter biting insects. The transition zone has been invaded by a pleasant-smelling weed we call perennial pepperweed. If you come back in the late spring and early summer, and the wind blows across the marsh, you'll probably smell the gentle floral aroma of the perennial pepperweed. As much as I dislike this plant for outcompeting our natives, I do admire the fragrance. By late August and September, the blooms have faded and the seed has set. Before we go further into the field on our audio tour, we need to make a detour up a little hill that lies right in the transition zone. We call this the Marsh Overlook Hill. This hill is straight west of where you're sitting right now at the Nature Center. On top of the hill are some benches and perhaps the opportunity to hear a kingbird. Kingbirds are mimics, like mockingbirds, and they're native to our part of California. The kingbird on the overlook likes to mimic other birds, but he also does a very impressive car alarm and a pretty passable siren. One out of many, many attempts, I managed to whistle an interesting enough tune for him to mimic, but I've had no luck since. A great deal of the bird monitoring we do out here at Rush Ranch depends on identifying bird calls. Kingbirds are wonderful, but they do make it more challenging for our researchers, who have to learn to hear the subtle differences between a kingbird and the species it mimics. I think kingbirds must have a sense of humor, because they do seem to mock our researchers. In fact, the kingbird on the hill nests in the coyote brush, but he likes to sit on our monitoring equipment. Fortunately, those antennae are picking up radio transmissions from tagged birds, bats, and butterflies, and not birdsong. Don't tell the kingbirds that we have audio recordings for tricolored blackbirds happening in Field 6. Coming down from the hill, we're progressing deeper into the marsh. The vegetation gets taller and taller the deeper we go. I'm 5'4", and there are many parts of the marsh in which the vegetation is taller than me. Most people call all of the tall plants that dominate the marsh tules, but there are actually multiple species, and not all of them are tules. Some of them are familiar from other wet environments, like cattails, but others, like bulrush and tricorner, may be something you haven't felt before. Try squishing the samples. That bouncy pushback from a gentle squeeze is because, unlike grasses, these grass-like plants are not hollow. They have pithy stems filled with a spongy vascular material called pith. There are some wildflowers in the tidal marsh, but I can't pick most of them for you because they are threatened or endangered. One of them is a dainty little daisy called the Suisun marsh aster. As the name suggests, it's found only in the Suisun marsh. Similarly, the Suisun thistle is critically endangered and found only here. In 2020, I was part of a team that tried to find and count every single individual in our part of the Suisun marsh. There were just over 2,000 plants, compared to over 60,000 in the 1990s. Research suggests that as the marsh is getting drier and saltier, partially due to climate change and partially due to human water use upstream, Suisun thistle is being replaced by that perennial pepperweed we talked about earlier. As we battle our way through the tules taller than we are, we come out into an opening, like breaking from a forest into a meadow. This is a pickleweed plateau, areas of the marsh that are naturally higher and drier than the surrounding areas. This is ideal habitat for the endangered salt marsh harvest mouse. The salt marsh harvest mouse is probably one of my favorite marsh animals. Harvest mice are a group of mice with extra long tails that are prehensile, like a spider monkey's. They use their tails to climb, and salt marsh harvest mice spend most of their time climbing in the canopies of tules, rushes, and pickleweed of the salt marsh. They can also swim when they have to, using their tails like rudders. The marsh is crisscrossed with sloughs, a winding network of waterways. Some are only a foot across, while others are 20 feet or more. Whenever we get close to a slough, the tules grow up around us, making finding the hidden waterways difficult. But this dense vegetation is ideal for some of our marsh birds. You might be surprised to learn that there is a species of hawk that actually nests in the deepest parts of the marsh. Northern harrier hawks, also known as marsh hawks, build their nests hidden in the tules and rushes of the marsh and hunt in grasslands. Rush Ranch is 2,070 acres, almost exactly half marsh and half grassland. This makes it ideal habitat as we have healthy marshes for their nests, adjacent to grasslands filled with ground squirrels and voles for them to hunt. As we pass through the marsh, we listen closely for endangered rails, another type of marsh bird. Rails are very elusive. In 5 years of trying, I have only heard one once and seen one on another occasion. There may be 3 species of rail in the marsh, but in 2018, when we did an extensive study, only 2 were found at Rush Ranch. The western property boundary of Rush Ranch is Suisun Slough. Suisun Slough was recently added to the Bay Area Water Trail. Like the Bay Area Ridge Trail, the Bay Area Water Trail seeks to circumnavigate the Bay Area, but with boats and kayaks instead of on foot. The Suisun Slough is home to river otters and supports a variety of fish. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of your visit to Rush Ranch. Please come again.